Good evening, Britain. There is a specific kind of heartbeat in a nation just before the social contract finally snaps. It's the sound of 12 major cities erupting in a coordinated surge of physical discord, while the government's trust rating plummets to a record low of -69%. Last night, the Whitehall varnish didn't just crack, it was pulverised. Across Britain, from the besieged barracks in Crowborough to the paralysed streets of Manchester and Newcastle, the working class has officially run out of patience. While the Prime Minister promised to close the commercial hotels housing the phantom population, official data now confirms that exactly 197 asylum hotels remain fully operational, draining billions from the taxpayer. Today, we are performing an institutional autopsy on a leadership that holds its own people in absolute contempt. To understand the arithmetic of anger, you have to look at the statistical shell game being played with the UK's borders. The establishment assured the public that the financial burden on their communities would end, yet in regions like Epping, the number of unregulated arrivals has actually increased by 20% since the administration took power. The nail in this narrative is the two-tier justice system. While actual violent crime surges and prisons are emptied early due to no space, the state rapidly deploys authority units to arrest local shopkeepers and veterans in Crowborough for defending their own streets. When the state protects the undocumented arrival over the safety of the British family, the social contract is no longer being managed, it is being liquidated. The national unrest we are witnessing is not just cultural, it is an economic uprising against systemic fiscal attrition. While generational British families are told there is no money for streetlights or winter fuel, the Home Office is quietly funneling £4 billion a year into the asylum industry, a figure projected to explode to £15 billion over the next decade. Taxpayers are essentially being held hostage, forced to finance their own demographic and economic decline. This isn't economic reform, it is a direct wealth confiscation scheme, where capital is extracted from the struggling working class and redirected to support a broken globalist project.
Look exactly 5 years into the future. If this catastrophic trajectory holds, the concept of community safety will cease to exist. Analysts warn of a violent fracture into two Britons. Heavily fortified green zones for the political elite, protected by private security, and permanent red zones for everyone else. In these areas, the police, already stretched to a terminal breaking point, will simply stop responding. You will be a hostile subject in your own homeland, taxed for the privilege of watching your country be given away. This isn't a policy paper, it is the logical conclusion of a system that prioritizes community appeasement over the rule of law. A nation doesn't collapse through external war, it collapses through internal surrender. The 12-city uprising is the opening volley of a massive, unstoppable reckoning. The elite panic in Westminster is justified. They designed the collapse. They profited from the asset stripping, but they cannot control the storm they have seeded. The curiosity of the viewer shouldn't be about whether the riots will end, but whether there is anything left of the old Britain to save. The last orders for the social contract have been called. The standoff has begun. The silence from Downing Street is no longer a strategy. It is a confession.
British taxpayers are watching their money being poured straight down the drain. Not metaphorically, but literally siphoned into thousands of taxi rides stretching across the country as the asylum system unravels in real time. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in Westminster. The Home Office, through its contractors, has been burning hundreds of thousands of pounds every month on cab journeys for asylum seekers, including £600 trips, running hundreds of miles, even when cheaper transport existed, and even when migrants themselves questioned the insanity of the policy. And the most shocking detail? Some of the ministers supposedly in charge only learned about it when the story hit the headlines. What follows is a scandal of waste, blindness, and bureaucratic collapse. The kind that exposes not just a policy failure, but a political system no longer in control of its own machinery.
In essence, the Home Office, in this respect, they've been paying £350,000 a month. Now, the reason for this is that migrants are moved into various asylum hotels, various houses of multiple occupation, all of that. But they get moved around. So under the Home Office rules, we, the taxpayer, we have to fund these and for some reason the rules are we can't put these poor people on trains or aeroplanes.
It began with a leak: Clear Springs Ready Homes. One of the Home Office's biggest contractors for asylum accommodation had been quietly authorising extraordinary travel expenses. According to internal figures, the government was handing over £350,000 every single month to just one taxi firm. One company, PTS 247, allegedly ran up to 6,000 journeys, some costing £600 each, often covering distances that any rational bureaucracy would serve with cheap rail tickets or domestic flights. But the rules are clear and inexplicable. Under Home Office guidance, migrants moved between temporary accommodations must retain their original GP registration. If they were allocated a doctor 200 miles away, the public, the very taxpayers footing the bill, must pay to send them back there. Not by train, not by plane, only by cab. One driver reportedly ferried a passenger from London to Scotland for a simple checkup. That journey alone could have bought a week's wages for a British family. When questioned, an Afghan migrant named Kadir described his 250-mile taxi ride for a knee appointment. He wanted to take the train. The Home Office forbade it. "We know they sip spending too much money," he said, "but we do not have a choice." The scandal remained buried until PTS 247 launched a legal challenge against Clear Springs for £2.75 million in unpaid invoices. Only then did the monstrous scale of the operation come into public view. Documents revealed allegations of fabricated appointments, phantom journeys, and migrants requesting lifts for nights out. Insiders claimed the system was so lax, so blind, that appointments could be invented without scrutiny, because contractors were required to move heaven and earth to fulfill every request. A two-tier system had quietly formed, one where asylum seekers moved freely across Britain by taxi, while millions of British citizens struggled to obtain a GP appointment in their own town. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood reportedly only learned of the scandal when journalists at the BBC and The Sun published it. Officials inside Downing Street reacted with disbelief. How could a £350,000 per month line item escape scrutiny? How did a contractor operate unchecked while the asylum budget ballooned to record levels? This is unfolding against a brutal political backdrop. The UK has just recorded over 41,000 small boat arrivals in the past year, the highest ever. Public anger is rising sharply. Anti-immigration protests across 2025 have escalated into street confrontations, becoming one of the defining domestic crises of the year. At the same time, Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government is pushing through the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act, aiming to restore control over a system widely viewed as overwhelmed. Migrants may soon need 20 to 30 years to secure permanent residency. Yet while ministers promise toughness, scandals like the taxi fiasco fuel a narrative of chaos, mismanagement, and preferential treatment. The NHS, already frozen under unbearable demand, is being stretched even further in high migration zones. Some GP surgeries report swelling caseloads that push local families to the back of the line. Dentists remain unreachable for millions. Against this suffering, the image of asylum seekers being chauffeured in Mercedes saloons for routine appointments has set public outrage ablaze. There is also the broader financial landscape. Between accommodation, welfare, legal aid, and travel expenses, the UK has spent £6.6 billion in just 5 years on asylum support schemes. And this is before factoring in the hotel crisis, a system projected to cost £10 billion by the end of the decade if allowed to continue unchecked. The political opposition argues that generosity has become a weakness. Critics inside think tanks warn that Britain's instinct to appear humane, responsible, and outward-facing has created a vacuum of accountability in which contractors thrive and taxpayers lose. This is not the first time transport contracts have exposed systemic rot. Local councils across England have faced public backlash over multi-million-pound taxi schemes for special educational needs. Pupils, necessary services delivered at inflated costs through poorly regulated private firms. Migration transport is simply another branch of a tangled, opaque procurement system, riddled with loopholes. But never before has the price tag reached this scale. Never before has public confidence in migration policy been so fragile. And never before has a Prime Minister entered office, promising order, only to watch a scandal so emblematic of dysfunction explode under his leadership. This affair strikes at the heart of the social contract. If taxpayers cannot trust government to safeguard their money, how can they trust it to safeguard their borders? In a country wrestling with rising inflation, economic pressure, mounting NHS waiting lists, and a renewed sense of national insecurity, the taxi scandal is more than an embarrassment. It is a symbol of bureaucracy losing control, of ministers out of the loop, of an asylum system so fractured that even reasonable migrants describe it as wasteful. With Britain attempting to stabilise relations with the EU, navigate a cautious stance toward US foreign policy, and manage rising domestic tensions, this scandal lands at the worst possible moment. The Home Office has launched an official investigation. Ministers insist this will never happen again. But investigations do not reverse the waste. They do not erase the anger, and they do not fix the gaping holes in Britain's asylum machinery. So Westminster faces a question that cuts deeper than any invoice. If Britain cannot control a taxi bill, how can it control its borders or its future?
They're going around there at all. Don't go around there at all. You can hear what's going on. Go as far down there as you can.
Westminster is vibrating, not from the usual political theatre, but from the sound of a government tearing itself apart from the inside. At exactly 5:15 p.m, the Whitehall varnish finally shattered. Keir Starmer, the man who promised to restore trust, is currently watching his own Labour MPs launch a devastating no-confidence vote against him. This isn't an attack from the opposition, it is a rebellion from the people who campaigned for him. The trigger? A secret Brexit reset with Brussels that critics are calling the ultimate sovereign capitulation. From the fishing waters of Grimsby to the courtrooms of Strasbourg, the verdict is in. The Prime Minister is fighting for his life, and the knives aren't just out, they are already in motion. To understand the fury in the chamber, you have to look at what was signed behind closed doors. Leaked documents reveal a deal that hands control of British fishing rights back to EU vessels until 2038. It reintroduces the oversight of the European Court of Justice, effectively putting foreign judges back in charge of British laws. To the fishing communities of Hull and Plymouth, this isn't diplomacy, it's a surrender of the very sovereignty they voted for. Labour MPs from red wall seats, once Starmer's loyalists, are now leading the charge. They aren't just calling it a mistake, they are calling it a betrayal of the working people. Inside the corridors, the vultures, names like Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting, are already being whispered as potential successors. The scenes inside the House of Commons were described as pandemonium. Witnesses saw a Prime Minister losing his composure, slamming his fists as the people he once called allies ran out of the chamber in shame. When the vote was finally counted, Starmer survived, but only by a handful of votes. In the newsroom, we call this a mortal wound. He is now a zombie leader, stripped of all authority, commanding only pity and contempt. Every policy he proposes from this moment on will be met with a security cordon of scepticism. The unity he promised was a fantasy, replaced by a party at war with its own grassroots. While Labour implodes, Nigel Farage and Reform UK are circling like predators. Farage has branded Starmer the greatest Brexit betrayer in history, and the polls are reflecting that sentiment. In constituencies that should be safe for Labour, the red wall is crumbling again. The public sees a leadership that would rather satisfy Brussels than the families in Hartlepool. Market confidence is wobbling, the pound has dipped. The government is no longer governing, it is simply trying to survive the next 10 minutes.
Keir Starmer may still be in number 10, but the authority has left the building. The no-confidence vote was supposed to bring clarity, but it has only exposed a terminal system failure. The curiosity of the viewer shouldn't be about whether he survived today, but how he expects to lead tomorrow. A leader who survives by a thread is a leader who is already gone. The hurricane in Westminster has only just begun, and the last orders for this administration have been called. The question is, who will be left to pick up the pieces when the final collapse happens? The silence from Downing Street is no longer a strategy, it is a confession. The game is up.